We have represented here as of before 5:30 were people from 17 states in this country, 3 countries, Japan, Canada, Germany, and of course the United States. We have 12 museums represented, many museum director, chief curators, scholars, representing 10 museums and 12 curators. We have, again, this is at 5:30, so those of you who just showed up, it's a big surprise. We have 9 collecting couples who are major patrons of institutional collections and work together with different institutions to build great collections of contemporary Japanese clay art, as well as other aspects of Japanese art. So it's extremely gratifying to have you all in this room. You know, my gallery, I can fit 25 people on 25 chairs. Here we have, looks to be over 125, 150 people gathered together to respond to the glories of Japanese clay art. So welcome everyone. We say we have a dream team panel here is an understatement. We have the best of the best who've all agreed to be with us here today. We have 2 very prominent, maybe just retired and just getting started, experts in the world of Japanese art, particularly clay, and 2 great collectors. First, and I'm going to do this in alphabetical order, we have Monica Binsick. And Monica, as you know, specializes in Japanese decorative arts, particularly lacquer. She grew up in Budapest, Hungary, and received her PhD from the University of Budapest, and a second PhD from the Ritsumeikan in Kyoto in lacquer. First, as a research fellow at the Metropolitan Museum, she studied the museum's holdings in textiles, lacquer, ceramics, and netscape. She, in a very short number of years, just 6, has been the co-curator of Kimono, A Modern History, a curator of Discovering Japanese Art, American Collectors in the Met, then Japanese Bamboo Art, the Abbey Collection, which traveled to venues in Japan. And most recently, she collaborated with John Carpenter and Melissa McCormick on The Tale of Genji, and currently has the now dark, wonderful exhibition titled Kyoto, Capital of Artistic Imagination. She was named the first Diane and Arthur Abbey Assistant Curator for Japanese Decorative Art. And perhaps most importantly for those of you here today, it's been due to her persistence and perseverance in obtaining and retaining the sizable and very valuable real estate at the Met dedicated to modern Japanese contemporary ceramic art. And there's nothing more fun for me than strolling over to the Met, even just for 30 minutes, walking up that grand staircase and walking past those balcony cases filled with the glories of Japanese clay art, in part thanks to HALSEY and Alice North, who I will get to in a moment. Our second curator of the evening truly needs no introduction other than stating she is a national treasure. But I must give Louise's few accomplishments that are focused just on our area today, some listing, and all of this was done during her tenure as the unique title of Curator of Asian Ceramics at the Freer and Sackler Galleries of the Smithsonian. Louise, I won't give the date. She wrote the book Shigaraki Potter's Valley, which was reprinted 20 years after it was first issued. Her other book publications include Isamu Noguchi and Modern Japanese Ceramics, A Close Embrace of the Earth, Seto and Mino Ceramics, and more recently, her book on Chigusa and the Art of Tea, which she did with Andy Watsky, about the leaf storage jar named Chigusa, acquired by the Freer Gallery. Relevant to us is her very illuminating essay that she wrote for Soaring Voices, Contemporary Japanese Women Ceramic Artists, and we're going to talk more about that exhibition as we go forward. In 2012, Louise was awarded the 33rd Koyama Fujio Memorial Prize for her research on historical and contemporary Japanese ceramics. and the Smithsonian Distinguished Scholar Award. Phew. Alice and Halsey North, who I think everyone on this call knows very well, are the founding leaders of the North Group, which has helped many nonprofit organizations with fundraising, planning, and development for over 30 years. But more relevant to us are the work that they've done as pioneering collectors of contemporary Japanese ceramics. Their collection was featured in the exhibition Contemporary Clay, Japanese Ceramics for the New Century, which was held at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston in 05-06 and traveled to Japan Society in 07 and 08. Together with Joe Earl, they wrote the accompanying exhibition catalog that was reprinted 3 times. They have since donated the major portion of their collection to American museums. But most notable for us tonight is that which was acquired by the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where many of their works are on display on the great balcony, the Great Hall balcony, and of course in the Japanese galleries. And I must easily say there are no greater cheerleaders for the field other than Alice and Halsey. Maybe we would not be here today without their guidance, persistence, and enthusiasm. Right. And lastly, but hardly least, is someone who may not be known to many of you, Sarah Billinghurst Solomon. Sarah was born in New Zealand and was awarded an honorary doctorate in music from Victoria University in 2009. But she began her career in 1972 as artistic administrator for the San Francisco Opera, eventually becoming the assistant general manager for artistic affairs for the New York Metropolitan Opera, but otherwise known as second in command. From this position, she retired after 42 years, an illustrious career over 42 years in opera administration. As stated in the New York Times, Sarah is, quote unquote, one of the most important people in opera you've never heard of. As she supervised the artistic budget, directed the artistic and musical staffs, ran their young artist development program and audition programs, their foreign tours, and offsite programming. Sarah remains involved in the arts, including now serving on several boards, that of Carnegie Hall, Santa Fe Opera, Juilliard School, Mariinsky Foundation, and the English Concert in America. Sarah is also passionate about women's health and human rights and is on the board of the International Women's Coalition and chair of the Women's Healthcare Council of Columbia University Medical Center. But most importantly for Bob and myself, we really consider ourselves blessed to have this amazing woman as one of our dearest friends. And also, for me, as an enthusiastic collector who's endowed with an extraordinary eye for form, design, and color. So guys, that's our panel. Couldn't have a better one, as I said. I'm thrilled that you are all here with us. We have worked hard over the last couple weeks to put together, I hope, an engaging program for you. And so we are going to start with an introduction to the artists themselves. Can we get them on here somehow, Tracy?
If each of them would say hello, they should come to the front of everyone's screen.
Okay. So I'm thrilled to say we have these women were supposed to have two independent solo shows. But in the world we live today, since there is no actual physical show, and since time has no meaning anymore, I mean, time truly has no meaning, having a show with a start date and an end date also has no significance at this point in time. So it seemed appropriate that we seize the day, as people are liking to say these days, and take the opportunity to introduce both of them to you now and to make their works available now, even though they're sitting in our storage facility in Kyoto waiting for an airplane which can actually bring them here. Oh. As some of you may not know, there is only one flight per week between Tokyo or Japan and New York, and there is no commercial transportation of commercial goods at all unless they're needed supplies. So everything has just stopped. I cannot send a FedEx package to Japan. No one can send a FedEx package to me. So everything is just status quo. Our first artist I would like to introduce is Inaba Chikako. Inaba-san, would you say hi to our friends? Can you hear me?
Konnichiwa, hello.
Oh, there you are. Konnichiwa. I was first introduced to Inaba-san. As you may know, I find artists many different ways, but this was a first for me. I was introduced to her by her in-laws. And her in-laws are artists that I've represented for quite some time, well over a decade, Hoshino Satoru and Hoshino Kayoko. And when I first saw Inaba's work, where she was a good bit younger than she is now, the work had great potential, and I bought some pieces first just for daily use for our home. We use them for cake and salad, and we enjoy them. And I have the flower vase that sits behind me here is by her, and I have another little vase that sits in our Paris apartment. And I thought when I saw her work, I was really interested and wanted to follow it. And over time, the work has become better and better. And when I was there, I guess now about a year and a half ago, it clearly was time. She was ready for a solo show. And it was very exciting to be able to see a young artist develop in this way. Inaba is inspired by the curling, withering leaves of local vegetation like lotus, hosta, and orchid plants. And with their pronounced vagues, she creates very elegantly furled sculptural vessels. Her white, fluted, curving forms appear like leaves ready to contain droplets of dew or descending raindrops. Each form is unique and equally seductive. Inaba-san, while residing off the shores of Lake Biwa, was born in Yokohama and went to school at Musashino Daigaku University in the College of Art and Design. And she has won awards both in Taiwan and in the Mino competition. Tanaka-san, are you connected, I hope now? Tanaka? Ohayou gozaimasu.
Ohayou gozaimasu.
So as I was introduced to Inaba-san by illustrious ceramic artist, my introduction to Tanaka-san, who's 15 years her junior, was through another wonderful artist by the name of Kondo Takahiro. And Kondo-san has been a friend of multiple decades. We've worked on many projects together, and he's never once in all those years recommended any artist to me. So when he said he saw her work and handed me a competitive catalog where a picture of her work was the size of a postage stamp, I said yes. And he immediately got on the phone and made the introduction on the telephone, and we've started to work since that great recommendation. Like many of her contemporaries, Tanaka-san, of her contemporaries of women artists, Tanaka-san's focuses on sculpture rather than function. And she focuses on clay objects that appear to be vessels contained within a cloth container. In this way, she is trying to engage the viewer to use their imagination of what might be truly inside that cloth wrapper, and to consider the issue of function. The object that's within is functional, but you have no access to it, versus non-function. She too was not born in Kyoto, but went to university, to Kyoto Saga Daigaku, and has also won awards, wonderful awards from the Kyoto Municipal Museum of Art and the Kyoto newspaper, Kyoto Shinbun, and also from the competition that happens biannually at the Nippon Club. And Halsey and Alice, were you one of the judges when you picked her for the second prize? Do you remember?
Not that year.
We certainly.
Oh, 2018.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, you weren't the judges then, so whatever. Okay.
After our time.
Okay. And our last member, but very critical member of our team today, is Yoshizawa Tomo, who's our interpreter, who lives in Tokyo. She is what she calls a cultural translator. It was a term coined by her colleague, and actually she feels it describes exactly what she does. She is born into a family of craftsmen. Her mother is a weaver, and her father is a Kyoto maker of Kyoto instruments. She now writes and translates mainly in the field of Japanese crafts and culture, bridging the cultures of many different countries, generations, and societies. And I can say I've worked with her before. Her command of English is formidable, and I know she'll be an asset to us tonight.
Thank you.
Both artists reside and work in Kyoto. They came from outside. They're born outside Kyoto, as I mentioned, but many artists for centuries before have both come to Kyoto to be professional artists. Why do you think this is so? And this is a question I'd like you, Louise, to consider as a craft historian and also as a curator. It's interesting to reflect upon their work placed within the physical and cultural environments of the city of Kyoto. And I think it's an important question to consider from both artists' point of view.
Thank you, Joan. It's a pleasure to be here as part of this event. And yes, Kyoto is an important setting for both of these artists. I was thinking a lot about Kyoto earlier today, and thinking that there must be no place in the world that's more ideal to live and work as a ceramic artist, and at the same time, perhaps no place in the world that's more terrifying to do so, because there's such a deep, deep history and an enveloping atmosphere of demanding connoisseurship, patronage for ceramics, as well as many other craft traditions. Kyoto's been a capital, or was a capital city, for 1,000 years. And the presence of the imperial court, the presence of the noble families that supported the court, presence of all of the temples and shrines that were supported as well by those families and many others, created, and the presence of merchants and people engaged in commerce, created a market like no other for the work of all of the craftspeople who lived in the same city, starting with the carpenters who built the temples, the shrines, the palaces, the mansions, and even the wonderful smaller homes of everyday people, townspeople, and craftspeople. And within this network of patronage was the presence of ceramic artists. Elsewhere in Japan, the great regional ceramic traditions, Shigaraki, Seto, all the kilns in Kyushu, were by and large centers of anonymous workmanship, making standardized pieces that everyone needed and used and recognized, but they didn't recognize the work of those regional potters by their names. They recognized them by the kilns where they were made. Whereas in Kyoto, amazingly, from the late 16th century, potters who were working in the capital city were known by name. And people who used their ceramics recorded their names in their letters and their tea diaries. And so we know the names of people like Chojiro and other potters who, from the late 16th century, were based in Kyoto, making ceramics and in a very special way, interacting with their audience. That continues up to the present day, but giant figures in the world of Japanese ceramics, such as Ninsei, who was active in the middle of the 17th century and started applying his own seal to his work, marked a way in which ceramics were identified with their individual makers in Kyoto, as they were no place else. The demands of the audience for Kyoto ceramics were for a high level of refined workmanship for a polished sense of decoration closely related to the workshops of painters based in the capital city, and for a refined sense of color. And I think in the work of both Inaba-san and Tanaka-san, we see echoes of those high standards for quality in ceramics, and not only technical quality, but expressive quality. And it's wonderful to see it in their work, see echoes of things that happened over the centuries in Kyoto to establish Kyoto as really a center for a unique kind of ceramic production. I want to tip my virtual hat to Monica's exhibition, the lovely Kyoto, Capital of Artistic Imagination, because that exhibition in the dark right now in the Met has done so much to evoke the atmosphere of Kyoto in which Inaba-san and Tanaka-san work. And I look forward to hearing them talk about why it is that they made the brave decision to work in Kyoto. And they're under the scrutiny of living artists and under the mantle of the tradition of many centuries of past artists. And so the demands on themselves must be very high indeed. But clearly they have absorbed those models, and each of them expresses them in a particular way in her work. And I really look forward to hearing what they have to say about what they're doing.
It was the perfect response, and it actually leads in ideally to asking my next question to Monica. Because Monica, of course, you put together this amazing Kyoto show that hopefully when the lights do go on in the Met, we'll be able to revisit and enjoy yet again, all our best friends sitting there in the darkness. And luckily they're sitting in the darkness, so hopefully it will reopen in the near future. And as a curator, and as someone who so brilliantly installs Japanese ceramics on your balcony cases and quite beautifully in what used to be the George Nakashima room at the Met now, and even integrating contemporary clay with antique material in your Kyoto show, how do you find working with both historical and contemporary Japanese decorative arts integrated within an exhibition? How do you find the balance, and how do you find that as a challenge in an aesthetically successful way? And how do you make that dialogue work in your installations? And you could take this one step forward. If the Met did own a piece by either of these two young women, how might you have contextualized it within your current exhibition?
Thank you for the invitation, Joan. It's a wonderful event, and it's my pleasure to join you tonight. And Louis' comments made me homesick. I really want to go back to Kyoto now.
Me too.
So seeing Tanaka use works which resemble objects and boxes wrapped in furoshiki, wrapping cloth, reminded me that in Japanese art, there is a long tradition of a kind of mischievous edge, artists showcasing skills to evoke different, sometimes surprising textures and creating convincing visual illusions. Many of these works were made for the own delight of the artists, or sometimes as commissions to entertain eccentric patrons. These type of artworks fit into the category of trompe-l'œil, the French term meaning deceiving the eye. These works make us question the boundary between the real world and the artistic imagination, as well as the reality of the artwork itself. Often, trompe-l'oeil works have a humorous or parody-like aspect as well. From the world of contemporary Japanese ceramics, we can mention Mishima Kimiyo's hyper-realistic compositions achieved through a unique combination of silkscreen and ceramic. Her works, often featuring waste and consumer culture, can be associated with ready-made art, art informal, and op art. Another leading female artist who comes to mind is Matsuda Yuriko, whose works are whimsical transformations of everyday objects, sometimes influenced by American pop art. On the other hand, Inaba Chikako's works relate to a very different tradition in ceramic history, the beauty of white vessels, including porcelain and stoneware with white glaze. The tradition of using white clay, which had kaolin in it, had been known in China since the Bronze Age, but its use didn't become widespread until after the 6th century. White porcelain had been produced in the Bangshan area of Korea for about 600 years. In the Joseon period, in the 15th century, white, simple vessels of great quality were produced at the court kilns and supplied to the royal family, reflecting the Neo-Confucianist idea of a restrained lifestyle. Jumping to the world of contemporary Japanese ceramics, I would like to mention Kuroda Taizo, one of the leading artists of contemporary Japanese clay, who was captivated by the beauty of these pure white Joseon Korean pieces. He started to make unglazed, high-fired works around 1992, and he is exploring the perfect space in his works. I couldn't resist to mention Edmond Duval, an artist based in London, who often creates narratives of collections and display using only white ceramics. Duval was inspired by seeing Chinese white wares, and his works represent a dialogue between minimalism and architecture. And I would like to call your attention to the beauty of light and shadow of these white wares and the beautiful form, the shape of the piece, which is really unique to this type of vessels. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Monica. That was wonderful and very insightful. And I don't know how you got all that into like 3 minutes of comments, but very illuminating. So now we'd like to bring the artists, wake them up from their morning nap, and get some insight from them as to their process and how they feel their work is created, why it's created, and why we are all so entranced by it.
基本的な紐作り成形で、特別私独自の方法ではありません。手びねりで底面から積み上げて、完成の形まで少しずつ進めます。形が出来上がった時点ではまだ表面はつるっとしています。その後に葉脈の流れとなる線を当てて、それに沿って削いでいきます。その線の入り方はクロッキーやモデルを作る段階では大まかに、決めてはいますけれども、実物でするのは最大限の注意を払って集中して時間をかけて行います。線の流れ方が重要で、その密度や角度の違いによって形が表す見え方や意味が変わってしまうので、どういった線がこのできた形を最大限に活かせるのか検討し探りながら進めていきます。葉脈の削りも大きく分けて3段階に分かれていて、最初の粗削りから微調整しながら線を整えて、その後エッジもはっきり決めて、くぼんだ部分の深さも全体で合わせていきます。 最終仕上げとしてエッジをしっかりピッと立てて完成となります。
Louise, why don't we start off with you with your first question for Inaba-san.
Okay, thank you. Inaba-san, どうもありがとうございます。おはよう。
ありがとうございます。
It's a pleasure to see your work. It's really lovely to see the images. I look forward to the time when I can actually hold it. I'm wondering for you what it was like to move your ceramic practice from Kanto to Kansai and to set up a studio on the edge of Kyoto and fit yourself into the Kyoto ceramic world. Was it difficult? What was difficult about it? What was positive about it? What did you learn from entering this new?
現在拠点は京都のお隣の滋賀県になります。結婚を機にこの地に移り住んだのですが、決め手は制作ができる空間があったことなんです。正直に申しますと、初めは滋賀に住むことはあまり気が進まなかったんですが、今では大好きな土地になりました。目の前には大きな湖がありますし、背後には山々があって田畑に囲まれてとても静かで制作に集中できますし、京都大阪に近いので文化的な展覧会や文化的なことなどを見に出かけ刺激を受けることも簡単なのでとても良い場所で気に。
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Monica, do you have a question for Inaba-san? Okay.
Thank you, Inaba-san, for the lovely presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
So the question is, could you tell us about your inspiration to create pure white vessels representing nature? Were you inspired by Chinese and Korean examples as well? Many of the ceramics representing leaves or flowers are actually in color. So I really would love to hear about your thoughts about the white.
葉っぱのその線の流れとそれからなる形を表現したいので、白がそれらを率直に表現できると今考えていますし、今使っている白濁油は柔らかさがあってさまざまなものを受け止める包容力があるところも気に入っています。古代中国磁器のキリッとしたラインも李朝のおおらかな形と柔らかみのある白には引きつけられますので、少なからず影響は受けていると思います。それからもともと白で表現されているものにとても惹かれます。それは焼き物に限らないんですが、一つの白い作品の中で表面のテクスチャーの違いや素材の違いなどで淡い表情の差や陰影の濃淡の差の変化を見せるものなどはもともと好きです。
Thank you.
Thank you, both of you. Thank you. I think looking at these images on the screen, we can get a great sense of what Inaba is trying to convey to us with her very sensuous works. So might I now switch to Sarah with her question for Inaba-san?
As I've said, I find line and form extremely important in anything that I'm looking at and liking. And these are so extraordinarily beautiful, but they're all based on one kind of leaf, I think. And what I would love to know from the artist is, how does she get such variation in the works that she's doing? Does she know exactly what she's going to end up with when she starts, or does it change as she is making the piece? And the other thing is, in a practical matter, they all look so incredibly difficult to make. How many actually make it through the drying and firing without cracking?
一本の木から生えている葉を見ても、幹についているときはどの葉も同じように見えるのですが、幹から切り離されて枯れたときに、一枚一枚それぞれ違う形に変化をします。たとえ同じ種類の葉でも、一つのその姿が一つとして同じものがなくて、個性的で意志のようなものを感じて興味深く見られますし、またその造形も美しくてとても魅力的です。ある葉は運命に抗って身もだえているようにも見えますし、また別の葉はまるでこう受け入れて覚悟をしているようにも見えますし、また別のものは軽やかに状況を楽しんでいるような葉の姿にも、そういうものもあります。同じ種類の葉でもこれだけさまざまな個性による姿の変化の違いがある上に、この地球上には無数の植物が生きています。私自身の興味の対象が変わったり、感性が枯れなければ、モチーフの対象となる葉は身の回りにも他のどこかの土地にもたくさんあると思っています。それからどれぐらい成功して出来上がるかですけれど、はっきりと成功率のデータがあるわけではないですが、60% から 70% ぐらいでできるでしょうか。やはり大きいほど乾燥も調整も気を使いますし、成功率も下がります。ですが、小さいからといって油断は大敵です。
Great, thank you. Thank you, that's beautiful. Our last question for Inaba-san comes from Halsey and Alice. Would you like to pose your question?
Have you always focused on the leaf form, or have you developed it over time? How has it evolved?
もともと使うための器を最初は作っていたんですが、その時は葉をモチーフにすることは少なかったんですけれども、食器という器もただ食べ物を入れるだけでなく、人と人をつなげたり、何かを受け止めるものであるという考えがありました。そういう思いで食器などを制作していく中で、枯れたハスの葉に出会って、それを観察するうちに、枯れ葉から受けるインスピレーションとこの器の観念が合致して今の作品になっていきました。でそのインスピレーションっていうのは、葉が枯れて命が終わっても水をためて土に帰り、次の命を育む準備をしているように感じられて、その覚悟が尊く美しいと思い、造形的に表現できないかと考えるようになったのが今の容器を作るきっかけです。
I want to turn our direction towards collectors versus curators. We've had a little historical background and art historical curatorial analysis to ask Alice and Halsey a question. As collectors who's been passionate about this field for over 3 decades, you have really been at the forefront as there's been a sea change with the rise of women in this field. And like myself, you have traveled to see these exhibitions, most prominently Soaring Voices, that was held at 10 venues in the United States between 2009 and 2013. And you even helped support the English language version of that catalog. So my questions to you is twofold. How important do you think that exhibition was for American collectors and inspiring American collectors? And by collectors, I mean both institutional and individuals. And two, how important do you think this exhibition was for the artists themselves who were asked to participate in this exhibition?
Wow, it's a joy to be here. Soaring Voices was really a wonderful celebration of women artists. And in America, it opened our eyes to several generations of artists that we really weren't aware of for the most part. There were a lot of new artists in that show and younger artists that the American audiences simply hadn't been exposed to. So in terms of the American audience, I think it opened up a lot of eyes, a lot of new work that we hadn't seen before. And American collectors bought a number of pieces out of that show. And I know American collectors contacted you and other gallerists to get work by these artists. And it made a huge difference in terms of our perception of what was available and what was beginning to be developed. It also got a number of museums to think about exhibiting contemporary Japanese ceramics, and they were really happy with the response because the audiences, in many cases, were much larger than they expected. So all of a sudden, museums realized there was an audience for this work. So there was an excitement generated by that audience. So on one hand, it helped sell work, which helped support the artists. And on the other hand, it helped the institutions realize there was a much larger audience for this because it's very accessible work. In Japan, well, the show also went to France, and that was really a feather in everybody's cap. But the show also went to 2 venues in Japan. So it began to give artists more visibility in Japan, one, because it was shown in 2 major venues, but also when a Japanese artist has exposure in the West and press in the West, it really fattens up their resume. And the artists in that show could list all of these exhibitions they'd been in across America, and that gave them more prestige and more recognition. And so in terms of the artists who participated in the show, it gave them more status within the ceramic community and the collecting community in Japan. So people paid more attention to them. So I think that's very important. But what another thing that's interesting though, if you look at the cover of the catalog, you'll see on the Japanese translation, it doesn't mention the women artists at all. It doesn't talk about contemporary women artists. It says something like the delightful work in contemporary clay or something like that. And there's really not that much of a distinction in the culture between women artists and artists. It's something that in America has become important, but is not as pronounced in Japan. And I think it's fascinating that it's not even in the title in the catalog. But there's been a long tradition of women artists in Japan since the war. Before the war, they very seldom were involved. There are only 2 major artists that were actively involved that we were aware of, Tsujikyo and Koyama.
Maybe.
Can you hear me?
I don't, suddenly.
Suddenly you've gone off. The Zoom
We
meeting
can
is
hear
over.
you,
Hear you
Halsey.
fine.
Oh, okay.
Okay,
Hear you
it's
fine.
our screen.
Our screen has gone blank. Tsujikyo and Koyama, Mrs. Koyama, were both really wonderful artists before the war, but their husbands encouraged them to be active in the ceramic world. And it wasn't until after the war when artists had a chance to go to university and study ceramics in university that the world began to open up in a major way for women. So Soaring Voices really documents that whole opening up of the ceramic world to women through the development of education at universities. And I think the 2 artists today are really a wonderful flowering of that tradition. They're yet again the next generation who have been able to study at university, hone their skills, study with masters. And in fact, today, the predominant number of people in ceramic programs in universities are women. So there's a whole quantum shift in the ceramic world in terms of women becoming a very major power source in the field. So the women today, I think, represent that shift. I love the leaves in terms of, especially the ones that reach out and have an aspirational quality to them, in a sense of seeking to the light and a reaching up. I love the way she branches them up, and there's a sense of aspiration to them that's really quite exciting. And the bags and the wrapped furoshiki, I love it when you can't tell what's inside. I like those much better than the ones where you can tell what the form might be like. But if you can't tell what the form is, then there's a sense of surprise and secret and anticipation. It feels like there's a present waiting for you to unveil. So It's got that history of the wrapped piroshki, but it also has that sense of color and shape that's much more contemporary. So she's had a wonderful way of bringing history and contemporary feeling and colors together all in one work. So I think both artists have done a wonderful thing, and that is they have developed their own unique voices. And it goes back to what Louise says. Kyoto is a pressure cooker of creativity. And if you can't discover your own voice, you get destroyed. And you have to be strong, and you have to be disciplined and create and speak with your own voice in a very strong way. And both of these women have been able to accomplish that successfully, and we congratulate them.
Yes.
That was brilliant, Halsey. Thank you. Really brilliant. Thank you. Louise, correct me if I'm wrong. My recollection is when the title of Soaring Voices needed to be done in 2 languages, the curators of that show, Nishimaya and Hiroko-san, fought very hard with their male director to have the character for woman in the title, and they were refused.
I'm sorry, Joan, I don't know that story.
Yeah. My recollection from Nishi-san was that this was not her choice of title whatsoever.
Interesting. No, it just means fascinating, works that fascinate, but it doesn't specify gender.
Yeah. So it's Japan.
Japan.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Norths. I know that was a collaborative effort. Thank you, Alice. Sarah, can we move on to you? As a native New Zealander who has worked and resided in the US for many, many decades and has been so involved with the magic, beauty, and pageantry of the world of opera, please tell us how and when you came to fall in love with Japanese ceramics, and what you personally look for when you wish to acquire one. Do you look at the form, the color, the technique, the surface? Do you gravitate towards function, non-function? And how do you like to use them within your home?
Well, I started off being very interested in ceramics when I was about 16 years old and just going to university in Wellington, New Zealand. And my favorite cousin opened one of the very first ceramic studios with things for sale in Wellington, New Zealand. And at that time, and even now, New Zealand potters were very, very active. People had New Zealand pottery in their homes a lot, both useful and just beautiful to look at. And many, many of the New Zealand potters studied in Japan. So there was a lot of give and take between Japan and New Zealand. And then I moved to San Francisco and continued to collect the odd piece from New Zealand when I could. And then I moved to New York and I met my husband, who about 25 years ago, who was a great friend of yours. And he had that very beautiful Celadon piece, which is actually in one of the photographs, which I think everyone's looking at, by the flowers. And I fell in love with it. And then I met you, and actually you taught me everything I know about Japanese ceramics, and you also sold me everything that I have practically. But as you can see here, I use them everywhere. I use them very mixed up with sort of rather antique furniture that we have. I have them all over our houses. I've got a small collection of living women photographers, which I feel they work with very well, even though it is so different in feeling. And when I'm actually looking for something, I don't really think of myself as having a collection. I look at things and I really buy things that appeal very viscerally to me. I need to look around at everything you have on exhibit, or even when I look at things online or something like that, and there's always something that has enormous appeal to me. And usually it's shape, form. Sometimes it makes me amused. some of them that I have. I do like color some of the time, but then I love the very simple white pieces, which are very much like a meditation to look at. So I've got a very wide taste, I would say, in what I like, but I buy only something that I really want to live with. And I get enormous enjoyment out of all the pieces that I've bought over the last 20 years. I just love to be with them and spend time looking at them and thinking about how they were made and the people who made them. So that's really the story of my quote collecting.
Thank you, Sarah. Oh, could you go back, Tracy? These are some highlights from Sarah's collection, so you can see how eclectic she is, from a Bible by Araki to a beautiful Fujikasa. The lower left-hand corner, you see a work by Hoshino Kayoko, the mother-in-law of Inaba-san. Perfectly timed. And actually, yes, everything here is Sarah made by a woman artist. You have Yoshimi at the top, who lives in Paris, Futamura, and Hayashi Kaku at the bottom, who lives outside of Mashiko. Okay, Tanaka-san, I hope you are there. On this first slide, you can see her process, which is mind-boggling. And we have a number of questions. Maybe this time we'll start first with you, Monica. We'll mix it up.
Okay, thank you, John. I'm fascinated by the Japanese art of wrapping, and almost anything can be wrapped in a furoshiki, regardless of its shape or size. And most of Tanaka-san's works indicate a vessel or a box inside a wrapping cloth. So how do you design and plan the form, and how do you develop the idea of a certain object hidden and covered by the cloth?
作品が器の包んだ形なのは、包むという言葉が出始めたときに、陶芸を勉強していた私にとって身近にあったのが、その食器を布で包むということだったからです。包むものを決めるときは、それがどういった目的の器なのか、どんな形が美しいなのかを考えています。また、頭の中でシワの形をしっかり想像してデザインを決めていますが、最初の頃はその包みたいと思った壺や鉢を借りてきて、実際にそれを布で包んで形を観察していました。
Thank you.
Great. Louise?
Thank you. Thank you, Tanaka-san. I'm fascinated by your wrapped forms and the images we saw of your work on view in the Biwako Biennale, installed in Japanese rooms and tokonoma, help to give a sense of scale. And perhaps I'm misunderstanding because I can't see the real work, but it feels to me as though your wrapped objects are larger than life size in some way, as though they assert their presence in the space in a way that's related to their exaggerated scale. Is that something you think about when you're making your work, how big it will be? Or is that my misunderstanding of the images I'm seeing?
作品の大きさは中に何を包むかによって決めています。今は壺や、鉢が多いんですが、それがどのような状況で使われるかをイメージして、それに見合った大きさを作っています。
Mhm. But if you're saying that you're now using basically tsubo, jars, or hachi, big bowls, as your contents for your wrappers, they're getting bigger naturally. Is that the case? Why are you focusing on jars and bowls?
そうですね。私にとっては、大きな壺とか鉢っていうのが、大学で勤めていましたので、かなり身近な存在だったんですよね。で、もちろん小さなものもありますけど、その大きな壺に、その材料を入れていたりとか、水が溜まっていたりっていうのがあったので、その特別その作品のために大きなものをイメージしたというよりかは、身近にあった器の中に大きなものもあったっていうのが正しいと思います。
Thank you, ladies. Actually, some of those works, when you saw that briefly in the video that didn't play well of the Biwako Biennale show, those large tsubo that easily are, 2.5 feet or maybe 3 feet, you know better than I, Louise, about large storage jars and the idea of these enormous vessels, and just imagine them being transported from the factory to be off to the sake brewer, the rice grower, or whatever. They had to be carried in something. And I think her works are very evocative of that ancient past. And those kinds of vessels, although I would argue that her works look like they have very contemporary versions thereof inside rather than antique vessels inside. I'm going to ask Alice and Halsey their question, but Tracy, could you bring back the process slide where we're actually looking at how she carves her work? I think that's really interesting. We didn't spend enough time looking at that.
Give me just a moment and we'll get back to that.
Well, Tracy's doing that. I'd like to ask, you've mentioned a couple of times your study in university and in school. Had you always planned to be a ceramic artist, or did you pick it up during university and your interest in clay in university? How did you become a ceramic artist? What was the motivation and what was the beginning? Was it in school or earlier?
実は大学に入った時は油絵を勉強するために芸術大学に入りました。ただ私はもともと体を動かすことがとても好きだったので、制作にももっと体を使うようなことをしたくなっていって、たまたまそこで陶芸と出会って陶芸の道に切り替えました。
And that was at university.
はい、大学での話です。
And as a follow-up, how do you like to think of you're our youngest artist. How do you like to think of yourself as a woman artist, as a Japanese artist, as a young artist? How do you define yourself in the world of ceramics?
私が一番しっくりきたのは、若手アーティストというところだと思います。やはり活動の場所が京都を中心っていうのもあって、たくさんの先輩作家の方々とお話しすることが、多いというのが一つあると思います。もう一つは、私の作品は明るい色を出すために比較的新しい材料を使っているんですが、そういったものに全然抵抗なく手が出せたというのも若手だからなのかもしれないです。
And that actually leads me to our last question of the evening. I apologize that we're running a bit late. Hard to time these things with translations and technical challenges, but I want Sarah to ask Tanaka-san her question, which I believe also relates to color. Sarah?
Yes, I would like to very much to ask her how she chose those wonderfully vibrant colors, which I have to say, when I saw them on the screen, I immediately wanted to buy them because everything around us is so dire and so dreadful that looking at those made you happy and feel that there was something to look forward to in the future. Anyhow, why did she choose such wonderful yellow, red, blue? And when we were on tour with the Metropolitan Opera, which I was there 3 or 4 times in Japan, we received a lot of gifts. And the gifts were always wrapped like this, but they usually were wrapped in textiles that had wonderful patterns on them. And they were often indigo blue and rather than these wonderfully vibrant colors. So I'd like to ask her how she chose these colors, and does she see herself ever using also other textile looks on her pieces?
とその油絵を勉強していたっていうのもあって、その陶芸作品であっても、こういわゆるじんわりとした色というよりかは、このような発色のいいはっきりとした色の方がこう私の中ではしっくりきたっていうのが大きいと思います。この材料は日本にはないので、人から聞いたりとか、いろいろ自分でも試してみて、その海外からそのような材料を取り寄せて使ってます。とても簡単な材料のようで、結構癖があるので、慣れるまでとても時間がかかったんですが、それはその研究によって、より明るく、けど深みがあるっていう色をだんだんと出せるようになりました。
Okay, well, thank you. That was illuminating. And I can say when I visited Tanaka-san in her studio, she was showing me the jars of glazes that she was using at that time to create that wonderful saffron turmeric yellow cloth-like surface. And there were actually more than one glaze was used. It was sort of an orangey glaze layered with the yellow glaze. And when you look at them really closely and you get out a magnifying glass really closely, you can actually see the pixelization, if you will, of different colors to make that vibrant color. So I can understand why she's saying it was very complicated, not just painting on a single color at all. Do visit our website after dinner. I'm sure everybody's hungry. And take a look at those videos that my team worked so hard to put together, and sadly you couldn't see. They even have a musical score and they're very charming. So thank you all.